The universe had seen countless wars, but none had ever begun over a cup of coffee. Yet, here stood Crothar the Executioner, a 10-foot-tall alien warrior bred for battle, his body covered in shimmering, unbreakable armor, his fists capable of crushing steel. And across from him? A man in a stained apron, holding a half-empty coffee pot, blinking in confusion. The shop smelled of burnt espresso and panic. Ethan Carter didn't know how he got here. A second ago, he had been arguing with a customer over whether oat milk belonged in cappuccinos. Now, a massive, war-scarred creature with glowing red eyes was breathing down his neck, demanding his execution. Ethan had no idea what he'd done to deserve this, but judging by the size of the guy's axe, it must have been pretty bad. It had started with a mistake. A small, stupid mistake. A few months back, Ethan had been working on a satellite for an old military contract, something about decommissioning experimental weapons. He had pressed a button, one button, without reading the manual. The next thing he knew, NASA was on the news talking about an unexplained energy blast from orbit. Turns out, he had accidentally fired an old space laser. He never imagined that laser had destroyed an approaching alien fleet. He certainly never imagined the fleet had belonged to Zygron the Unyielding, a warlord feared across galaxies. Far above Earth, Zygron had watched in stunned silence as his ships vanished in a blaze of unexpected destruction. His war council had immediately begun theorizing that humans possessed hidden planetary defenses, maybe even superweapons. But Zygron was not a warlord who feared the unknown. He had conquered planets far more advanced. So he had laughed, flexed his clawed fingers, and declared, "If they think they can kill my men and escape, they are wrong. Send Crothar. He will show them the meaning of true war." And so, Crothar had arrived on Earth, crash-landing through the roof of Ethan's cafe, scattering tables and shattering the pastry display. Ethan had barely had time to register what was happening before the alien warrior stood up, dusted himself off, and growled, "Human! You will die for your crimes against the Empire!" The customers screamed. Someone dropped a bagel. Ethan just stood there, still holding the coffee pot, staring at the hulking creature in front of him. "Crimes?" Ethan asked. Crothar cracked his knuckles, each movement producing an unsettling crunch. "You destroyed our fleet. You, the most feared warrior of your people, shall fall today." Ethan looked around. His employees had already bolted out the back. A guy in a corner booth was recording on his phone. The espresso machine was still hissing. He sighed. "Buddy, I have no idea what you're talking about," Crothar roared, swinging a massive, double-headed axe. Ethan ducked purely on instinct, and the axe cleaved straight through the menu board, sending sparks flying. A second later, the lights flickered, and the shop smelled like burning circuits. Ethan scrambled backward. "Whoa, hey! This is a business, man!" Crothar lunged again. Ethan grabbed the nearest thing, his coffee pot, and flung it at the warrior's face. The steaming liquid splashed over Crothar's skin, and the alien let out a deafening roar of agony. The shop went dead silent. Ethan blinked. "Wait, that actually worked?" Crothar staggered back, clutching his face, his armored hands trembling. His species was immune to fire, ice, and most poisons, but scalding liquid? That was new. His mind raced. Had this human just wielded some form of biochemical warfare? Had he been too arrogant, assuming that this warrior, this unassuming cafe owner, was harmless? Ethan, meanwhile, was having an entirely different crisis. His shop was wrecked, there was an alien crying in the corner, and there was still an oat milk argument he hadn't finished. "Okay," he said, pointing at Crothar. "I don't know who sent you, but I don't have time for this. Either pay for the damages or get out." Crothar slowly straightened, his face still steaming from the burn. He felt humiliated. Defeated. No warrior had ever done this to him. He had trained against monsters that devoured stars. He had slain creatures that breathed black holes. And yet he had been bested by an earthling wielding coffee? He turned to his communicator. "Commander," he muttered, barely able to process what had happened. I have been defeated. There was silence on the other end. Then, the deep, rumbling voice of Zygron. Impossible. How? Krothar hesitated. There was no honor in this defeat. He couldn't possibly explain that he had been taken down by a steaming beverage. So, he did the only thing that made sense. He ended the transmission, activated his emergency recall, and disappeared in a beam of energy, vanishing from Ethan's cafe in an instant. Ethan stood there, still holding the coffee pot. He let out a slow breath. Right. That's definitely going to be a bad Yelp review. Far above Earth, aboard the warship Oblivion, Zygron and his war council watched as their once mighty warrior reappeared in the teleportation chamber. Or rather, half of him did. Krothar was missing an arm, his armor was shattered, and his body was covered in burn marks. He collapsed onto the floor, still trembling. The war council gasped in horror. If Krothar had returned in such a state, then Earth was not merely dangerous, it was a death trap. Zygron stood from his throne, his massive silhouette casting a shadow over the entire chamber. This cannot be, he muttered. What weapons did they use? Krothar shook his head. The human, he is unlike anything I have faced. He clenched his fist. He used something that burned my skin. Something beyond fire. Something terrifying. The warlord narrowed his eyes. The council began murmuring among themselves, theories forming. The humans, they have weapons even our strongest warriors cannot withstand. If they can do this to Krothar, what can they do to an army? We must reconsider this war. If even one human can cause this, what horrors await us? Zygron's teeth clenched. He would not accept defeat so easily. But neither could he ignore what had happened. Meanwhile, Ethan sat down on the floor of his cafe, looking at the destruction around him. Broken tables. A fried electrical system. A missing warrior. He exhaled and rubbed his temples. Well, he muttered to himself. That was a weird day. Krothar lay in the medical chamber of the Oblivion, staring at the ceiling, feeling something he had never felt before in his entire existence: shame. His missing arm was being reconstructed with nanites, his armor was in pieces, and his pride had been shattered beyond repair. The healers whispered as they worked on him. No one dared say it to his face, but he knew what they were thinking. He had been sent to eliminate a single human and had returned in pieces. There was no honor in this. There was no dignity. He had failed. Outside the chamber, the war council was in chaos. The footage of Krothar's disastrous mission had spread across the ship, and now the once feared warrior was a cautionary tale. If Krothar had been defeated so easily, then what chance did any of them have? Some of the commanders were even whispering about negotiating with Earth instead of invading. That was an unthinkable idea just hours ago. Zygron sat at the head of the war table, staring at the holographic replay of the fight. He watched as Krothar, his greatest warrior, had struggled against a human who didn't even seem to understand why he was being attacked. He saw the coffee. He saw the panic. He saw how, with pure dumb luck, the human had humiliated his best soldier. Zygron crushed the armrest of his throne. This does not make sense, he growled. Krothar is an elite warrior. How did this happen? The council hesitated. No one wanted to be the one to tell Zygron the obvious truth. Finally, a small, nervous advisor spoke up. Perhaps, the humans have secret techniques beyond our understanding. Zygron's eyes narrowed. Secret techniques? The way he fought, the advisor stammered. It was not conventional. He used unpredictable tactics. His environment. Even his beverage was a weapon. If this was one of their weaker warriors, what does that say about the rest of their forces? Silence filled the room. The idea was terrifying. If this one human could dismantle a warrior like Krothar so easily, then perhaps Earth was far more dangerous than they had assumed. Zygron refused to believe it. Krothar was simply unprepared. This human is not a warrior. He was a fluke. We need intelligence. We need to learn their true capabilities before we proceed. The War Council nodded in agreement. Sending another brute force attack would be foolish. Instead, they needed to observe, infiltrate, and analyze before making their next move. Zygron turned toward his intelligence division. Send Nzari. He will find out the truth. Nzari was not a warrior like Krothar. He was a shapeshifter, a master of stealth and deception. His specialty was blending in, gathering information, and striking when least expected. If there was anyone who could uncover Earth's secrets, it was him. Aboard Earth, Ethan Carter was just trying to get his life back to normal, but that was proving impossible. His shop had made it onto the news, though the official story was some vague nonsense about a gas explosion. People were already coming in, whispering, pointing at him, and asking ridiculous questions. "You're not like an undercover agent, are you?" a customer asked. "No," Ethan sighed, handing them their change. "Are aliens real?" another asked. "Apparently," he muttered. "You have to tell us if you're a government experiment," one particularly insistent conspiracy theorist argued. Ethan leaned against the counter and stared at the guy. "Yeah, sure. I'm a super soldier designed in a lab to make the perfect cappuccino." The worst part? The government actually had knocked on his door. A pair of men in suits had shown up the day after the incident, flashing their badges and asking all sorts of annoyingly vague questions. Ethan had done his best to explain that he had no idea what happened, that he was just trying to run a business, but they didn't seem convinced. Now, every time he left his apartment, he felt like he was being watched. And he was. Nzari had arrived on Earth, adopting the form of a human male, blending in as seamlessly as possible. His mission was simple: observe Ethan Carter, determine the true extent of his abilities, and report back. The problem was, Nzari had never actually been to Earth before, and he was not great at blending in. The first mistake was his choice of disguise. He had selected what he thought was a typical human look: a completely symmetrical face, perfect posture, and absolutely flawless skin. But instead of looking normal, he looked like an uncanny wax mannequin, and people kept staring at him like he was a robot. His second mistake was getting a job at Ethan's cafe. It had seemed like the most logical way to stay close, but Nzari had no idea how coffee worked. On his first day, Ethan handed him a cup. "All right, so this is an espresso shot. Just press this button here and..." Nzari pressed every button at once, causing the machine to explode in a cloud of steam and boiling water. Customers screamed. Ethan groaned. "Okay, that's a bad start." Nzari, trying to recover, muttered, Yes. Human machinery is inefficient." The third mistake was his understanding of human customs. When a customer left a tip, Nzari handed it back, whispering, "Bribery is unnecessary. I am already watching you." When a child spilled their juice, Nzari hissed and backed away, because he had never encountered a child before and assumed they were larval humans prone to spontaneous combustion. When someone asked for a decaf latte, he stared at them for a full 30 seconds before finally saying, "Why?" Ethan was losing his mind. By the end of the first week, Ethan was absolutely convinced that Nzari was the weirdest, most socially inept person he had ever met. But for some reason, customers liked him. They thought his awkward, robotic mannerisms were hilarious, and they kept coming back to see what strange thing he would do next. Meanwhile, Nzari was completely baffled by Ethan. He had spent days observing him, searching for any indication that he was the warrior Krothar had described. But Ethan didn't train. He didn't sharpen weapons or prepare for battle. He didn't even seem to remember what had happened. Had Krothar been wrong? Had he been deceived? The thought was unsettling. But before Nzari could report his findings, everything changed. The government had been monitoring Ethan closely. They had intercepted an alien transmission. They knew something was coming. One evening, as Ethan was closing up the shop, they came for Nzari. Unmarked black vans surrounded the building. Agents stormed in. Nzari panicked and tried to teleport, but they hit him with a disruption field before he could escape. Ethan barely had time to react before he was shoved against the counter. What the hell? Stay put, one of the agents said. That thing isn't human. Ethan watched as the men dragged Nzari outside. For the first time since this whole mess started, he realized this wasn't over. And he had a very bad feeling about what came next. Ethan sat in a cold, windowless room, his hands gripping a styrofoam cup of coffee that tasted like regret. The fluorescent lights above him hummed softly, filling the silence that stretched between him and the two men in suits sitting across the table. He had been dragged here after the whole alien barista getting arrested situation, and now they were staring at him like he was some kind of cosmic anomaly. One of them, a thin man with sharp eyes, finally spoke. Ethan Carter, do you know what's happening? Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. Well, let's see. My coffee shop got trashed by an alien. Then another alien got hired as my barista. And now the government just kidnapped him in front of me. So no. I have no clue what's happening. The other agent, broader, with a military posture, folded his arms. We've been monitoring extraterrestrial activity for years, but you've drawn attention from something way bigger than we anticipated. Ethan took a sip of his terrible coffee. Great. Just great. So what now? You gonna Men in Black me? Erase my memory? The thin agent smirked. No, actually. We need you to cooperate. Ethan raised an eyebrow. With what? The agent leaned forward. We believe the alien you were working with, Nzari, is a spy. And we also believe he's not the real threat. Our intelligence suggests there's a much bigger problem coming. A warlord named Zygron. Does that name sound familiar? Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. You mean the guy who sent the walking medieval tank to kill me? The broad agent nodded. Yeah. That one. And he's not done with you yet. Ethan exhaled slowly. Of course he's not. The thin agent continued. Look, we know you didn't mean to get involved in this. But for some reason, Zygron thinks you're some kind of ultimate warrior. We have two choices. Either we tell him the truth and risk him deciding to obliterate the planet, or we convince him that you are exactly what he thinks you are. Ethan blinked. Hold on. You're telling me the government's best plan is to pretend I'm some super soldier? The broad agent smirked. It's better than letting them think they can just invade Earth unchecked. Ethan set his cup down. You guys are insane. The thin agent sighed. Maybe. But we're running out of time. Meanwhile, on the Oblivion, Zygron was pacing in front of his war council, his patience wearing thin. It had been too long since Nzari had last reported in. The silence was suspicious. Zygron had expected to learn valuable intelligence about Earth's defenses, but now he was beginning to suspect the worst. The council whispered among themselves, fear creeping into their voices. The humans had already defeated Krothar, and now it seemed they had captured Nzari as well. Zygron clenched his fists. This was unacceptable. If Earth truly had warriors capable of dismantling his forces so easily, then he would not sit back and wait for them to strike first. We move to Phase 2, Zygron announced, his voice like rolling thunder. We send an invasion force. We crush them before they crush us. Some of the advisors hesitated. One of the elder strategists spoke carefully. My lord, if this human is truly as powerful as we believe, an invasion may not be wise. Perhaps, negotiation? Zygron's glare could have melted steel. Negotiation? With a species that has already humiliated us? No. We show strength. We send a message. Back on Earth, Ethan was being dragged into something he wanted absolutely no part of. The government had a ridiculous plan. Make it look like Ethan was preparing for war, make Zygron believe he was getting stronger, and hope that fear alone would keep the aliens at bay. And somehow, they had managed to convince Krothar to help. Ethan nearly had a heart attack when the massive alien warrior showed up in the underground training facility the government had brought him to. Krothar stood there, his arm now fully restored, but his pride not so much. The warrior grunted, staring down at Ethan like a man forced into the most humiliating job of his life. You, Crothar muttered. Me, Ethan said, just as unimpressed. The thin agent clapped his hands together. All right, boys. Let's get started. Ethan groaned. I hate everything about this. The training began, but it was less training and more a series of disasters. Crothar had been given strict orders not to actually kill Ethan, which made him incredibly frustrated. Ethan, meanwhile, was horrible at everything. Sword fighting? Ethan tripped over his own feet and nearly stabbed himself. Hand-to-hand combat? He barely managed to land a punch on a training dummy. Weapons training? He shot a laser rifle, ricocheted the blast off a wall, and took out a surveillance drone by accident. The agents watching from the observation deck winced. Crothar stared at him, unblinking. You are the worst warrior I have ever seen. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead. Thanks. That means a lot. Despite the failure after failure, the illusion was working. The government had been broadcasting fake training footage to intercepted alien transmissions, making it look like Ethan was becoming an unstoppable force. And it was working too well. Back on the Oblivion, Zygron watched in horror as new footage surfaced. Ethan Carter dodging energy blasts. Ethan Carter lifting impossibly heavy objects. Ethan Carter sparring with Crothar like a true warrior. None of it was real. But Zygron didn't know that. He clenched his jaw. This human was growing stronger. If they waited any longer, Earth might strike first. We attack! Zygron growled. Immediately. Back on Earth, Ethan had just finished throwing up after a particularly brutal training session when the alarm blared. The agents stiffened, their earpieces buzzing. One of them turned to Ethan, his face pale. We've got a problem. Ethan sighed, wiping his mouth. Let me guess. Zygron took the bait, and now he's coming to kill me personally? The agent nodded grimly. Something like that. Ethan groaned. Of course he is. The sky above Earth began to darken. The Warlord had arrived. The sky split open with fire as Zygron's fleet descended upon Earth, their massive warships blotting out the sun. The people below stared up in horror as the atmosphere crackled with energy, the air thick with an unspoken dread. Cities went into lockdown, governments scrambled, and Ethan Carter? He was currently sitting in an underground bunker, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, trying to figure out how his life had led to this exact moment. The alarms blared around him, red lights flashing in synchronized bursts. Agents scurried past, barking orders into radios, coordinating last-minute defense plans that wouldn't matter if Zygron truly believed Earth was a threat. Ethan sighed. So, just to be clear, the plan is for me to go out there and, what? Glare at the guy until he leaves? The thin agent from before, now looking significantly more stressed, shook his head. You challenge him to single combat. Ethan nearly choked on his own spit. I do what? The agent leaned forward, voice low and urgent. Zygron is a warlord. He respects strength. If he thinks Earth has a warrior powerful enough to challenge him, he might back down. But if we refuse to engage, he'll see that as weakness, and he'll wipe us out. This is our best shot. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. Wow. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. The broad agent, standing nearby, adjusted his earpiece. It's either this or global extinction, Carter. You decide. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. Unbelievable. Just unbelievable. Outside, Zygron stood on the bridge of his flagship, his piercing yellow eyes locked onto the planet below. His armor gleamed under the dim light of the warship's interior, his massive frame exuding sheer dominance. Reports from his scouts indicated the humans were scrambling. He had expected resistance, but so far, Earth's defenses remained silent. Cowards! He muttered under his breath. A transmission request blinked on his control panel. One of his officers turned to him. It's them. Zygron smirked. Finally. Let's hear what they have to say. The hologram flickered to life, and Ethan's face appeared. He was not in armor. He was not wielding any weapon. He looked tired. Extremely tired. Zygron frowned. So, you are the warrior they call Ethan Carter? Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. Yeah, that's me. Listen, this whole thing? Massive misunderstanding. I am not the guy you think I am. Zygron narrowed his eyes. You expect me to believe that? After you humiliated Crothar? After you outmaneuvered my spy? After I watched footage of you training with impossible speed and power? Ethan set his coffee down. Okay, first of all, that was fake footage. Second, Crothar lost to hot coffee. And third, I have no idea what I'm doing, man. I'm a barista. Zygron let out a slow, dangerous chuckle. You think you can deceive me with false modesty? I will not be played for a fool. Ethan groaned. Great. Just great. Zygron stepped forward, his voice filling the entire warship. The time for words is over. We settled this in battle. You and me. Single combat. If you win, I leave. If you lose, Earth burns. Ethan rubbed his temples. You're really not giving me a choice, huh? Zygron's grin was all teeth. No. Minutes later, Ethan stood in the middle of a massive, empty field outside the city, staring up at the single most terrifying creature he had ever seen. Zygron loomed over him, clad in heavy battle armor, wielding a weapon that looked like it could vaporize a tank. Ethan cracked his knuckles, mostly because they were stiff from stress. All right. Let's get this over with. Zygron didn't waste time. The Warlord lunged, moving far faster than anything his size had a right to. Ethan barely had time to react before a shockwave ripped through the ground, sending him flying backward. He hit the dirt hard, coughing as dust filled his lungs. Zygron stalked toward him. Is this all you have? Ethan groaned, rolling to his feet. Oh, buddy, you have no idea. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the single most dangerous thing he had ever wielded. A travel mug. Zygron hesitated, eyes narrowing. What is that? Ethan unscrewed the lid, letting out a dramatic sigh. A secret human weapon. We call it triple espresso. Zygron's stance faltered. Ethan took a sip. Pure caffeine-fueled rage surged through his system. His pupils dilated. His hands stopped shaking. His mind snapped into overdrive. He charged. To everyone watching, it looked like he had suddenly unlocked a new level of power. In reality, he was just experiencing the highest level of jitter-induced reaction time imaginable. Zygron swung his massive weapon, but Ethan dodged, fueled by a combination of blind panic and caffeine tremors. The Warlord snarled, striking again and again, but Ethan wasn't where he was supposed to be. Then, the unexpected happened. Zygron's foot slipped. Ethan, purely on instinct, reacted. He shoved the Warlord. Zygron, caught off balance, stumbled. His armor, heavier than anticipated, made recovery impossible. He tripped. Fell. And face planted directly into the dirt. Silence. The War Council, watching from orbit, stared in horror. Their warlord, the most feared being in the galaxy, defeated. Zygron groaned, lifting his head. Dirt clung to his face, and for the first time in his life, he knew what humiliation felt like. Ethan, breathing heavily, stood over him. So, do I win? Zygron growled. His instincts screamed to crush this human, to regain his honor. But the War Council was watching. The entire fleet was watching. If he attacked now, after falling on his face, it would only make things worse. Zygron exhaled sharply, standing up and dusting himself off. Very well, he muttered. Earth is under your protection. Ethan blinked. Wait. What? Zygron turned away. I will not challenge one who has bested me. You have proven yourself. Your legend will spread across the galaxy. Ethan stared at him, realization dawning. Oh my God! He whispered. You actually think I'm a warrior now? Zygon boarded his ship without another word. The fleet left. The world celebrated. Ethan sat back down on the ground and finally finished his coffee. Somewhere in space, the legend of Ethan Carter, the Unyielding, had just begun. Ethan Carter never asked to be famous. He never wanted the attention, the interviews, or the conspiracy theories that now surrounded his name like an unstoppable hurricane. But after a galactic warlord publicly acknowledged him as the most dangerous warrior in the galaxy, there was no going back to a quiet life. He tried. He really did. He reopened his coffee shop, hoping things would settle down, but the universe had other plans. The first sign that life was never going to be normal again came 2 days after Zygon left. A group of tourists showed up at his cafe. Not regular tourists. Alien tourists. A mix of different species, some humanoid, some definitely not, all standing in line like they were waiting for an autograph. One of them, a large, scaled creature with 6 arms, stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Great warrior Ethan Carter," it said, voice rumbling like distant thunder. "It is an honor to stand before you." Ethan looked around, expecting someone to correct the misunderstanding. No one did. He sighed. "Look, buddy, I think there's been a mistake. I'm not a warrior." The alien nodded solemnly. "Of course. A true warrior never boasts of their strength." Ethan groaned and rubbed his temples. "No, seriously, I run a coffee shop. I make lattes. That's my skill set." The alien turned to the others, whispering in its own language, before looking back at Ethan with what he could only assume was admiration. "Ah. So even after your great victory, you choose to live humbly among your people. A noble path." Ethan considered arguing, then realized it would be pointless. The second sign that his life had permanently changed arrived when the government showed up at his door again, this time with an offer that was equal parts ridiculous and terrifying. The broad agent, the one who had been there since the beginning, sat across from him at the counter, sipping a cappuccino as if this were just another Tuesday. "All right, Carter. Here's the deal. We need you to act as Earth's representative." Ethan frowned. "Representative for what?" The agent set down his cup. "The galactic community. You see, ever since Zygon declared you the protector of Earth, other planets started paying attention. And now? They want to meet you." Ethan almost choked on his coffee. "No. Nope. Not happening. I barely survived that whole mess, and you want me to, what? Shake hands with aliens? Pretty much. No." The agent sighed. "Ethan, listen. You're the first human to ever interact with an alien warlord and walk away with a peace agreement. Do you know what that means? The entire universe thinks you're the guy now. If we don't send someone to these diplomatic meetings, they might take it as an insult. And if they take it as an insult, we risk another war." Ethan leaned back, rubbing his face. "You're telling me that if I don't go, we might get invaded again?" The agent shrugged. "It's a possibility." Ethan exhaled slowly. "God, I hate my life." It turned out, attending an intergalactic summit was exactly as horrifying as he imagined. They sent him up on a classified space shuttle, escorted by a team of government officials who were way too enthusiastic about the whole thing. The meeting was being held on a massive neutral space station, an enormous structure floating between galaxies, home to hundreds of different species. The moment he stepped off the ship, whispers rippled through the crowd. Aliens of all shapes and sizes turned to stare. Some pointed, some bowed, others simply watched with cautious respect. Ethan had never felt more uncomfortable in his life. A small, blue-skinned diplomat approached him, offering a deep nod. "Ethan Carter. It is an honor to welcome you." Ethan forced a smile. Yeah? Thanks. Happy to be here." The diplomat gestured toward the vast chamber ahead. "Please. The council is eager to hear your wisdom." Ethan swallowed hard. "Oh, great. My wisdom." Inside, a long, curved table stretched across the chamber, filled with representatives from dozens of different worlds. They all looked at him expectantly. Ethan sat down slowly, wondering how exactly he had gotten himself into this situation. An elder representative, a being with smooth, metallic skin and glowing yellow eyes, spoke first. Ethan Carter. Your name has spread far and wide. Some say you are the greatest warrior the galaxy has seen. Others believe you are a strategist beyond compare. We wish to know, what are your thoughts on the balance of power between our worlds? Ethan stared at them. They were expecting some kind of profound answer. Some kind of warrior's wisdom. He cleared his throat. Well, I think power is like coffee. The council leaned in. Ethan panicked. He had no idea what he was saying. But he had started, and now he had to commit. See, if you make coffee too strong, it burns out too fast. But if it's too weak, it doesn't do anything. You gotta find the balance. Just enough strength to get things done, but not so much that you make a mess. That's how power should work. Like coffee. Silence. Then murmurs. Nods. The metallic-skinned elders sat back, considering. Wise words. Balance must be maintained. Another diplomat, one with tentacles where their mouths should be, gestured thoughtfully. We have not considered this perspective before. Perhaps we have been too aggressive in our policies. This coffee theory is compelling. Ethan stared at them. They were actually taking this seriously. The blue-skinned diplomat smiled. You have given us much to think about, Ethan Carter. Perhaps the way of war is not always the answer. We look forward to your continued guidance. Ethan smiled weakly. Yeah. Guidance. That's me. The meeting concluded with unanimous agreement that Ethan's coffee theory would be incorporated into future galactic diplomacy. As he walked back to the shuttle, the agent beside him patted him on the back. Not bad, Carter. You might actually be good at this. Ethan sighed. I was just trying to make something up on the spot. Yeah, well, you just changed the course of intergalactic relations with a coffee metaphor. So maybe stick with it. When he got back to Earth, Ethan finally reopened his coffee shop for good. He had accepted that things would never be normal again. Sure, he still had regular customers, but now he also had aliens dropping by. Some ordered their drinks in languages he didn't understand. Some paid with glowing crystals or mysterious objects he couldn't identify. One day, Crothar himself walked in, now wearing what looked like a tracksuit. He nodded at Ethan. I require a beverage. Ethan handed him a cup. Still no hard feelings about the whole getting beaten by coffee thing? Crothar grunted. I am learning to respect the power of your ways. Ethan smirked. Yeah. Sure. Let's go with that. As Crothar sipped his drink, a small group of tourists approached, whispering excitedly. Ethan sighed, preparing himself. Great warrior Ethan Carter, one of them said, eyes wide with awe. Tell us, what is your next great mission? Ethan took a deep breath, looked at the long line forming in his cafe, and gave them the only answer that made sense. Making rent.